In this session, we'll be creating authentication policy for ISE. In our last session, we created individual policy sets in addition to the default policy set to create administrative organization around authentication and authorization policy. Let's go ahead and open up policy sets now and add to that. Okay, we see our default wired and wireless policy sets. Let's expand the wired policy set. We could see in place we do have one authentication policy rule in place, which is the default, and we're going to insert a rule immediately above that. This first rule, we'll set it up for wired and add conditions to support wired 802.1x. In this case, handy that they've got pre-built library conditions established to utilize that. We'll drag this over and add that to a condition match for our authentication rule. If we expand that out, we can see that it's labeled wired 802.1x, but in fact is matching a radius flow type as it's being sent by the wired NAT in this case. We'll use this to apply it into the authentication rule, and then at the end here we'll select the identity store that we want to send authentication requests towards, and you can see our demo.local there. In this case, we'll select all user ID stores, which will allow us collectively to investigate any possible identity store for 802.1x authentication. And if I expand out the options here, we can see that we can manipulate the responses from that identity store. If it authenticates authentication failure occurs, we'll reject the authentication attempt. But notice we could, in addition or instead of, we could do a drop or a continue. A continue in this case would continue down to authorization policy processing. We'll leave these defaults intact. And then we'll utilize the gear icon to insert a new rule, and we'll set up an authentication rule to support MAB. It's important that these labels go in such a way that when we are doing troubleshooting later on within the live log and etc., that these labels are helpful in terms of understanding what exactly was matched and within which policy set. Okay, we have a similar condition for wired MAB that we'll add, and we'll use this. And as often done with MAB policy, and we'll utilize this tactic for guest services later on, that there's an anticipation that MAB failure or MAB authentication failure will occur, and instead of rejecting the authentication attempt, we'll want to continue to be able to evaluate authorization policy rules and send that unauthenticated user, that MAB fail user, a redirect rule, for example, that will redirect them towards a portal where we can gain their credentials and understand who they are and deal with the MAB failure scenario in that fashion. So let's modify this to continue, and then we'll save this policy set. Okay, going back to policy sets, we now have 3 authorization rules in place for wired, or excuse me, 3 authentication rules in place for wired, and let's do likewise for wireless. And again, same tactics here. We'll just apply the different labels specific to wireless. And again, library conditions specific to supporting wireless flows coming in from the WLAN controller NAT, that we can see that's specifically matching that radius flow, and those will be attributes that will be added to the access request from the perspective of the NAT. Add the condition to support matching a MAB authentication request. And yeah, pointing out that MAB authentications will be sent towards the internal user identity stores, and just like we did for 8021X on wired, we'll do likewise for wireless, and we'll modify the options for the MAB rule to be able to continue if the user is not found, and we'll continue to authorization policy processing to be able to handle that MAB failure, that MAB authentication failure. And then we'll save this policy set. Okay, just got done adding authentication policy rules to each of our newly added policy sets. Now our next session we'll move on to develop out authorization policy and begin doing some initial testing.